Thank you. We have 2 more Sundays in Esther. I'm getting kind of hooked on Esther. Did I tell you when I was doing my research on this book, one commentator said, "Don't you ever preach through every chapter." I took that as a challenge. Every chapter is just so good, including this one today. The title of the message today is Necessary Endings, from Esther chapter 7. And I take that title from a book I recently read by Henry Cloud, a Christian psychologist and author. He wrote the book Necessary Endings. And in the book, he describes 3 kinds of people and 3 ways you have to deal with them. If there's 3 kinds of people, you don't deal with them in the same way. He said, with wise people, talk to them, give them resources, and you will get a return. With foolish people, stop talking to them about problems. They're not listening. And stop supplying resources. In other words, stop enabling them because they squander them. Instead, give them limits and consequences. And with evil people, to quote a Warren Zevon song, the strategy is lawyers, guns, and money. The reason? You have to go into protection mode, not helping mode, when dealing with evil people. Well, in Esther 7, we see all 3 kinds of people. They're converging at this happy hour, Esther's second feast. The king, the queen, and Haman are all there. One is wise, another is a fool, and the other is evil. Esther is the wise. She's in protection mode. She's trying to save her life and the Jewish people from a genocide. King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, he is the fool, and Esther shows him the unintended consequences of his policy by bribe. And Haman, he's the Hitler of his day. He's just pure evil. He must be stopped and brought to a necessary end. So the outline today, the chapter has 3 parts. First, we see the queen's wise request, verses 1 to 4. Then we see the king's foolish alliance he has with Haman. That's exposed, verses 5 to 7. And then Haman's necessary ending, verses 8 to 10. So let's read the Word of God. Esther chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom." He said that before. Did any of you try that at home? Yeah, okay. Well, Queen Esther's going to spill the beans right here. She replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. And if we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial of a matter to warrant disturbing the king." Isn't that interesting? Because Esther was sold as a sex slave, and then she became queen. Oh no, that's too trivial. This is way worse than that. So here you see the queen's wise request. Esther is risking her life again before these 2 powerfully explosive men, King Xerxes and Haman. They're the ones who decreed this destruction of the Jewish people. They decreed all the men, all the women, all the children would be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month. Now, that's just a few months away. I'm sure Esther rehearsed this conversation with the king many times. Do you ever do that? When you've got to talk to someone and have a conversation, do you rehearse that in your mind? I'm sure that she thought, you dirty rat. What is wrong with you? Murderer. But she didn't say that. She's wise with her words. If I have found favor. If it pleases the king. That's how she begins. And then she makes her request. It's very simple. Save my life and my people. It's like she's saying, help me. Someone's trying to kill me and my family. And it's true. And what a wise move on her part. She arouses the king's defenses without making him defensive. Now that's a good trick. If you can figure out how to do that, you can weave your way through all kinds of trouble. She arouses his defenses without making him defensive. As someone once said, nothing becomes important until it becomes personal. The king probably forgot all about this decree. Oh yeah, some people here and there, like stray cats and dogs, we're just going to get rid of them in a few months. Oh, but he remembers. Maybe he doesn't remember it was his decree yet, but he knows his queen is in danger. His wife is in danger. Nothing becomes important until it becomes personal. The king is taking this personally. And then Esther goes on to say, I've been sold. It's like she's saying, there's a bounty on my head. Who would put a bounty on the queen's head? Follow the money. Oh, the money corrupts people. The money always corrupts people. It never stops corrupting people. Remember Esther chapter 3, Haman offered the king 10,000 sacks of silver to kill, slaughter, and annihilate the Jews. That's about $2.5 trillion in today's dollars. That'll buy a lot of evil. If the king is listening, if he's paying attention, which he never does, he should be able to put two and two together right now that Esther is Jewish and this decree was against the Jewish people, and he has sold her out with Haman's blood money. I don't think he gets it yet. But he's mad, and Esther will use that to her advantage. Her request is a voice of wisdom for the king. It's just simple. Save me. Save me, king. So let's see what happens in verse 5. The king says, who would do such a thing? Now that's kind of funny if you think about it, because he's the guy, right? Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Haman grew pale. Now this is how you know he's caught. Look at the way he's acting. Okay. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. This is why when you have a difficult confrontation, you want to get all the people in the room at the same time. So even if someone's lying, you can see the body language. That'll give it away. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. He's seen that look before. The king is going to kill somebody, and I'm the guy this time. So here you see how the king discovers this foolish alliance he's had with Haman. Who would do such a thing? Now, Esther doesn't say, you're the guy, you're the man. Remember when Nathan the prophet had to confront King David? And he told that story about the cute little lamb and how the neighbor killed it so he could feed his company. And then Nathan said, you're the guy. No, she doesn't do that. She carefully aligns herself with the king as if to say, we have a problem. King, we have a problem. It's Haman. Verse 6, Haman is our adversary. Haman is our enemy. See how she does that? And I notice here the king's not angry at Esther for concealing her Jewish identity for 5 years, if he knows yet at this point if she's Jewish. I'm not sure if he's put it together yet. He's angry that he's in alliance with Haman, his closest advisor, the second in command of the empire. He knows what a fool he's been to trust him. But how does he make it right? Because, the king is never wrong. If you're the king of something, you're never wrong, right? You're never going to admit that you're wrong. I mean, how does he punish Haman when he was in on the alliance with Haman? How is he going to save face? They say that in the East, like China and places like that, it's so important to save face. You never let a leader into a place where they lose face. Well, that's true everywhere. We know all kinds of people who don't want to admit they've done wrong. West, east, north, south, everywhere. No one wants to lose face. So it was his own law that threatened his own queen, and he was in on it with Haman. So I just think this kind of thing happens all the time with our leaders. And I think a leader knows there's something terribly wrong, but they won't act. And they won't act because they're in on the bribe somehow. They've been bought somehow. And so then what do? They do this foolish thing, and they try to cover it up. They try to avoid consequences and accountability, and we know that always makes everything worse. So what is the king going to do? Is he going to try to save face and cover it up? Well, guess what? Haman comes to the rescue, and he gives him a way out. Verse 8, in despair, Haman fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden, and the king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. And then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman, king, let me just tell you something here. Haman set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." Now here's the first direct command you have from this king in the whole book of Esther. Impale Haman on it. He made up his own mind what to do there. So they impaled Haman. Some people think they hung him. Whatever it was, he was killed on that instrument of death that he set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. So here we read of Haman's necessary ending. It was swift, wasn't it? It was just. He was impaled on the pole he set up for Mordecai. As I said last week, God isn't just, but his justice is poetic. It's a poetic justice. It's exactly what he deserved. I read something as we go through the book of Esther that two words are repeated over and over again in the story. The word feast and the word fall appear several times. So Esther is a feast or fall story. And you can trace Haman's fall in Esther to his pride. And it happened early on. Proverbs 16 says pride comes before the fall. So we remember that when Mordecai refused to publicly fall, to bow down before him, that was the beginning of Haman's fall. He was deranged with anger from that point on. And then after that it says the dice fell. That's the Persian name for dice. The dice fell to select the day when he could annihilate all the Jews. And then in the last chapter, his wife Zeresh told him he would fall if he kept opposing Mordecai. That was almost prophetic. And then a few hours later, Haman falls on the queen's sofa. He's falling and he can't get up. You remember that? Just 5 minutes ago, Esther was begging for her life, and now Haman's begging for his. In a most compromising position, the king thinks Haman is attacking the queen. So I imagine in the morning paper, the Persian Bee, the headline was, Haman executed for assaulting the queen. Karen Jobes wrote this in her commentary, in this final scene, Haman falls before a Jew, a Jewish woman at that, whom he has unknowingly condemned to death, to plead with her for his life. On the couch of this Jewish queen, he falls all the way from his exalted position as second over the empire to an ignominious death as a traitor. The enemy of the Jews is executed for being an enemy of the king. So what does this chapter tell us? It tells us exactly what Henry Cloud said in his book, Necessary Endings. There are three kinds of people: the wise, the fools, and the evil. Esther is the wise one. If you trust her, she'll get good results, and she does. With foolish people like King Xerxes, don't argue with them, just show them the consequences of what they have done. And with evil people like Haman, go into protection mode. Use all the authority available to you to stop them and bring evil to a necessary ending. And that's the end of chapter 7. So let me apply this passage. I've got 3 applications here before we have communion today at the end of the service. First, let me say something about the human institution of authority, of government. God instituted human authority for what reason? To punish those who do wrong and honor those who do right. Sometimes we forget the other side of that. Like, okay, we know you're supposed to punish what's wrong, but we forget the side that God expects that government rewards people who are doing right. And that may be where the government is worse off, or whatever authority is in position. Now, thank God King Xerxes finally used his authority for good. He punished Haman. He rewarded Esther and Mordecai. We'll see more about that in the next chapter. But we know, don't we, that human authority gets it wrong. I mean, Xerxes was on the wrong page most of this story so far. And how do they get it wrong? When those in authority reward those who do wrong and punish those who are doing right, that is evil, pure evil. And many times they know better. But they've been bought. And they're selling out their people. And it always happens that way. That authority is not under God at that point. And then what do we do as citizens, as people in that case? You have to work like Esther and Mordecai. You have to be wise and use every godly and legitimate means to expose and bring that evil to a necessary end. God wants the church to be salt and light in cases like that. You know, when I prayed this week, I did my Saturday fast. Cindy joined me. And I pray for our government leaders every week. President, governors. I pray for the school, the superintendent of our school here, who's been a very, very good man. I pray that in the inner circle of our leaders, there would be an Esther and a Mordecai. That's a good prayer. So I invite you to pray that way. That in every inner circle of every governmental leader, there would be an Esther and a Mordecai to advise them with wise advice, who can't be bought, who tell the truth, who don't deceive, who aren't trying to worm their way into position. I encourage you to pray that way. Well, my second application is this. believers are to be sober-minded about the reality of evil. Evil isn't going away. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Verse 9. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. Resist him. Be sober-minded. Evil is real. It's not your imagination. Some things are just evil. We have such a hard time saying it, don't we? Because we've been conditioned to not say it. William Penn, one of the founders of our country, of Pennsylvania, he said, if we're not governed by God, then we're going to be ruled by tyrants. And that was Haman's plan. Haman was the Hitler of his day. There's a Haman in every age. You maybe run across a Haman at your business or maybe in your family. They're just bent on destruction. They seek to harm, especially harm God's people. Maybe a Haman has harmed you. Be watchful and go into protection mode. I said earlier that today's the day of prayer for the persecuted church. So the statistics are that in the past year, 340 million Christians around the world have experienced extreme persecution, discrimination. For what? Just for following Jesus, just for identifying as a Christian. That's the world we live in. So let's be sober-minded. And let's remember, 1 John 4:4, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And then finally, one battle, one turning point doesn't win the war. We're happy that Esther and Mordecai are saved. We're glad that the tide is turned. But remember, the Jewish people are still scheduled for extermination, for genocide on the 13th day of the 12th month. Well, that's still a few months off, so there's work to be done. We're glad for the one victory, but the war is not over. There's more to do. There's more for God to do as we look at the end of the book of Esther. And so likewise, let me say this. We should thank God for all the major turning points in our lives. I have seen God stir people up in the last couple of years. They've made things right with Jesus. And that's a good thing. I'm glad for that, but that's just one victory. That's one turnaround. You're still in the battle, right? Our battle against the world, the flesh, and the devil is not over. In some ways, it's just begun. So we need to pray for endurance. And here's my scripture today to meditate on as we prepare for communion. Hebrews 12. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. And we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion, who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and now he's seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. After all, you have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin. What is the key to winning our battles? What is the key to winning the war? It's to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.